Well, hello there. It's been a while, but shut up. HBO's The Last of Us has given me very conflicting feelings. On one hand, it's a very accurate adaptation of one of the most critically acclaimed games ever made, meant to capture a brand new audience that might not have otherwise experienced the story. On the other hand, I can't help but feel that when you are adapting pre-existing content, the goal is to bare minimum do as well as the source material. And I think that's where the majority of my issues come from while watching this show. Every single story beat, character interaction, and character introduction just feels better executed in the video game. Alright, maybe not every single interaction, but for the most part, if you have played the game and you are now watching the show, you're gonna feel like a lot of these scenes that you have already witnessed, you're now witnessing a lesser version of them, if that makes sense. And I think it comes down to character delivery and expression. Obviously, this entire viewpoint is contingent on having played the game, so if you haven't played the game and you're just watching the show, feel free to enjoy it, have your own opinion, disagree, it doesn't really matter. Alright, this is just my perspective on why, even though I do like the show, and I admit that it's doing very well, it isn't resonating with me on a level that I would like it to. I'm going to be splicing in some audio from a conversation I've had with a friend of mine to hopefully provide a different perspective about the first two episodes right after we finish watching the second episode. Please mind the difference in audio because I'm still figuring this YouTube out. Before I get too deep into what I'm not really enjoying, I'd like to first give credit where it's due. This is probably the greatest video game adaptation ever made. Now I know that bar is laughably low, but I knew the show was a hit with my own mother, who for context watches almost exclusively Lifetime movies or the news, was watching the show and was heavily invested in it. I use that as a metric because if she's invested in it, it has to be doing something correct. That sort of speaks to my overall thoughts on the intended audience for this show, but I'll come back to that. Another thing I think the show does exceptionally well is making creative choices that differ enough from the game to make the show unique, but are still believable in the established world. For example, connecting the infected through a hive mind, a decision based off of a study done on real-life fungus. It's little touches like that which give the show its own personality and surprise viewers who already know the content like the back of their hand. Another touch that I enjoyed was the audience getting to see the world a little bit before the infected took over and began the apocalypse. I think a change like that is necessary when you're adapting a TV show from a video game, because in the video game, it kind of has to keep moving at a consistent pace in order to keep the player engaged in the story. However, when it's a show, there's a lot more downtime, and sort of sitting in that pre-apocalypse world allows a lot more people to become invested. As a quick side note, the infected kissing test to spread the fungus was one of the most unnerving ways they could have gone about showing how it can potentially spread.
That shit was disgusting.
Keep that scene in mind though, because I'll be circling back around to how important that decision is and how it could elevate the show for everyone, not just first-time viewers. The last positive I'll note is the direct adaptation of scenes and specific lines from the game to the show. It serves two functions in allowing game players to directly compare the scenes, while also giving show-only audiences intriguing scenes that resonate with them. And here's when we get to the parts I didn't like.
Are they still? They're still headed like they're still headed west, right? Or
Yeah, like, and the reason why I know where they're going is because of the game. But like, I was watching, with, and she's like, so like, where are they? Where are they going?
Yeah,
Like, what she's asking me,
I'm
like, what's happening? Like, why are they? Why is this happening right now?
right,
And like, I
right.
had to explain it to her, and like, we were both just watching the show, and it's like, I cannot explain to you what's happening based solely on the show.
Yeah, like
And
you only know because of the game.
to be clear, when we say what's happening, we mean what the overall goal is, not literally what's happening right now, but where are the next steps? Where are we headed? What's the end goal of this whole adventure? Right. That, and there's probably gonna be like,
Well, they said it in the show, and you just weren't paying attention.
I'm just like, okay, cool. I
It
feel
needs to
like,
be emphasized more,
yes,
especially
it needs to.
because it's literally like the end of the episode. They're leaving. Like we finished this little chapter or whatever, so we need to know what's next. Like
Right.
what's ahead of us.
Right. Yeah. That's probably my biggest thing. That's
Right.
the
I
only
agree.
real thing that I disliked. Everything else was okay to acceptable. And don't get me wrong, I enjoyed this episode and the show so far overall. I enjoy it
Yeah.
overall. There are just little things that that they end up amounting to me just nitpicking. But let's get this out of the way right now. I'm not really a fan of Pedro Pascal as Joel. Don't get me wrong, he's a great actor. He's been killing it basically his entire career, and usually, anytime he's a part of a production, he's one of the standouts of that project. This time, however, I find his Joel to have a lot less personality than Troy Baker's Joel. That's video game Joel for anyone who hasn't played. There are hints of this throughout the first 2 episodes, which at the time of this recording are the only ones out now. One instance being among his first interactions with Tess when he finds her beat up by Robert's men. He gives off a different feeling than video game Joel, in that he's almost disconnected from the world. I guess the best way to describe it is the difference between someone who's cold-blooded, without morals, and someone who's constantly depressed. There's a lack of simmering anger that lies just below the surface that we've seen in Joel. He's constantly aware, judging the situation, sizing everyone up. Pedro's Joel to me seems more restrained, as if he just feels nothing inside. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just that in my opinion, having a ready-to-explode, ruthless Joel is far more interesting than a subdued one because it allows for him to stand out more from the people in the world like Tess or Robert or Marlene. On top of that, it makes his eventual warming up to Ellie more cathartic because we know he's on the complete opposite end of that spectrum in the beginning. I believe he captures the broad strokes of who the character of Joel is, but this just goes back to what I'm saying about trying to at least be as good as the source material. Another side note, he constantly goes back and forth with having an accent, at least as far as I can tell. Not really a big deal, it's just something I was continuously noticing. And for my last nitpick about Joel and Pedro Pascal as Joel, there are just some angles where he looks exactly like the character to me, and then other angles where he looks nothing like the character. I don't know, I'm probably just nitpicking because this isn't at all the worst problem you can have with a video game adaptation, in the slightest. I'd recommend watching Tess's death scene in the game and then the show to see which one you think was handled better.
Like, I thought it looked cool, like it was cool and everything with Tess's death, but I feel like maybe it wasn't hitting like the emotional cues it was like trying to. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I feel like it could have maybe been like a little more dramatic or like a little more impactful feeling, at least.
In my opinion, Joel's reactions were a lot more authentic in the game and a lot less shut down. I did a lot of rambling, but the point is that Joel feels well acted. He just doesn't feel like Joel to me, almost as if he's a new character. Moving on, I think another thing that doesn't sit right with me is the speed at which the characters are developing. That might be a weird way of putting it, but what I'm trying to say is that it seems like Ellie is entirely too comfortable around Joel and Tess, having only just met them. She jokes around with them, pretends to be infected, things like that, and it all just seems a little too familiar and friendly. Again, in the game, and maybe at this point you should turn that into a drinking game every time I compare the show to the game, but in the game, it takes a little more time for Ellie to warm up to Joel and Tess, especially Joel. In the show, Ellie seems a lot more connected to Tess, and the rapport that those two characters have should have slightly been shifted so that it was Joel who she attaches herself to. I know the writers are capable of forming that dynamic, I guess I just would have preferred if they tried a little bit sooner. Especially since there's only 9 episodes this season, and apparently season 2 will be an adaptation of the second game, which is set years into the future. Where the game had time to flesh things out and take its time, the show has to move at a much faster pace, so I think it'd be worth establishing the relationship this entire franchise is founded on a little more heavily. Ultimately, I think I've settled on the show perhaps just not being for me. Perhaps my exposure to the game is causing me to consistently draw parallels and lower my overall viewing enjoyment. And it's here where I'll bring up that point from earlier about the intended audience. It seems to me this show was made more so for people who haven't ever played the game in order to expose the franchise to a larger audience. With that in mind, I sort of scaled down my expectations because I figured that the likelihood of the show being better than the game was just entirely too low. Although, if the show keeps expanding the lore in its own way, making unique changes to it, it may be that perfect middle ground for new and returning fans. Just like the infected kiss, that's something never before seen in the game, which made me appreciate the show's existence that much more. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I believe the best path forward for the show is to tell the same story as the game, but gift wrapped in new and interesting ideas so that it isn't stale for people who already know it. But who knows? Episode 3 and on can make this entire video irrelevant and do everything perfectly. I'm definitely going to keep watching though, because I am interested to see where it goes, and hopefully I'll enjoy my time with the show a little more than I have been. We are only on episode 2, so there is that. The plan is to keep doing these videos as each episode comes out to chart my viewing experience, and just talk a little about my likes and dislikes. And if there's time in between, maybe I can talk about other shows or movies. Unfortunately,